So welcome. Hopefully you've digested well and we don't put you to sleep. But I'd like to start off by saying I'm just happy to be here. In my experience, like was it Joanna said, I come here more on the smaller side of the firm. I work for retail RIA, and I will allow my panelists to introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Joanna Marathakis. I am the Global Head of Financial Crimes Compliance at Circle, which is the issuer of USDC. Come from a background of working particularly with our product team and developing different solutions that are both compliant but also customer-friendly, but both from like a customer-facing product perspective and then also for all of our compliance tech.
Thanks. Delighted to be here, everyone. So my name is Emma Pollock. I am Chief Technology Officer at FinTrU. FinTrU provide client lifecycle management solutions, both in terms of people and services and technology, to some of the biggest banks in the world. So we're very familiar with all of the complex regulations and operational processes around both onboarding and in-life compliance for clients. My background is as a technologist, primarily in the financial services space, so a lot of experience with big financial institutions, including the New York Stock Exchange and Citibank, across all of the different compliance angles, including KYC, onboarding, and trade and communication surveillance.
So what I enjoy most about this topic is that it sits at the intersection of a few of my favorite things. It's excellence, it's trust, and it's technology. So as a compliance person, right, at the foundation of any decision I make is regulation. And then as a human, it's client experience and touch, right? So with that in mind, we understand that trust is the currency that undergirds all of our decision making, all of our interaction. And so with this panel, we get to discuss that critical intersection about delivering on trust while we onboard a client. So it's their first experience. And with that, we'll start with our first question, which is how can financial institutions strike a balance between meeting increasingly stringent compliance and a smooth, positive client onboarding experience? I'll toss it to you first, Joanna.
Sure. So I think the key here is really about designing onboarding in a way that's both compliant and client-centric and thinks about both from the absolute start. Compliance should never feel like a barrier when you're trying to onboard a customer. It's got to be embedded seamlessly within that client journey, right from the identification of a potential client through to the point at which they can transact. Technology should be a differentiator as part of that. You want the experience to be user-friendly, and well-integrated tech is absolutely critical to that. But it also means that you need to tailor the experience to what matters for your business, whether it happens kind of directly in the app or whether it's more of a face-to-face life cycle, or if you are actually referring out to an external vendor, can make the difference in how your clients are going to perceive the overall business. And I want to clarify, it doesn't mean that vendors should not be part of the solution. They're absolutely critical, but building them into the experience where it looks like part of your overall life cycle is really important. I think it's also really important to recognize kind of what your customer base is and potentially segment out the onboarding life cycle and experience depending on that segment. Dealing with an institutional customer base, much like we do at Circle, is a very hand-in-hand approach. We have partner managers that walk our potential customers the entire way through the life cycle. And a lot of what I do is actually train them on why are we asking specific questions so that they can help then educate the customer and make sure that we're doing a seamless and very quick experience for them. But then if you think about retail, particularly in crypto, people want very quick, they want automated, they want instant access, and it's a digital native customer base. And so they expect everything to be online. They don't want to talk to a human. And so that's really important to make sure that you understand the customer base. Anything to add?
I think for me, a lot of it comes down to what you've been talking about, right, Joanna, which is alignment and alignment of purpose. So you want to be able to do business with your client quickly. Your client wants to be able to do business with you quickly. You want it to be compliant. And I'm not sure that anyone has lots and lots of queues of customers out there that want to be doing business in an unsafe way as well. And it really is a differentiator in terms of how you do business. So starting to design from the ground up with that client experience in mind and making sure then that you're measuring how long is it taking you to get from that initial touch point until you can say yes to the client and the client can say yes to you is really, really very key to making sure that you have got the right processes and technology in place. And then that other piece of, compliance shouldn't be a barrier. One of my favorite quotes, and my team are really, really sick of listening to me about this, is from Mario Andretti, for any Formula One fans. The brakes make the car go faster, because applied at the right time, the right friction can actually speed up your end-to-end process. So being really thoughtful about when you want to go fast and when you want to go slow is also quite important.
Those are great points. And I would agree that, alignment and partnership matters. And even when we consider vendors, we like to consider, how are you complementing how I'm thinking about this, right? So if it is, I tend to be somebody who's very focused on the regulation, and then I want to partner with somebody who's going to be focused on the client experience, so that I am balancing, when you think about compliance and risk management, my own risk, right, my personal risk as a human being, what am I bringing to this equation that I have to kind of think about in a different way from when we onboard somebody through we move them in, like you said, to the first time you might be making trades in their account. So speaking of smooth experiences and alignment, we'll move to the next question, which is, what RegTech innovations are proving most effective in reducing friction during onboarding and ongoing client service without compromising risk management? And I'll kick it to you, Emma.
That's a big question, isn't it? So at FinTrU, we work with very, very, very large financial institutions. We have actually recently started to do some business with crypto firms as well. I think what you've said there really resonates with me, Roxane, which is that we don't consider ourselves to be separate, either in terms of our technology solutions or our services solutions, from what our clients are doing. Our job is to be there to do the right thing in the right place at the right time under your risk appetite as a client. This is an area for our clients that is really, really ripe for change. So what we see definitely is that there is lots of innovation out there in the space, but it's not yet really been adopted at scale. So it isn't just about what innovations are out there, because there are lots of different stuff that you can do right now in terms of speeding up your processes. There is absolutely an opportunity to make sure that orchestration of the process of onboarding is done in a much more centralized and much more transparent and tracked way, both for the client and for the institution. There are opportunities to do things like to interpret your regulations and turn them into policy faster. But what we're not seeing at FinTrU yet is large-scale adoption of these solutions across the clients that we work with. And that's for a number of different reasons. But they're all, to me, classic digital transformation reasons, which is that in order to be successful with any of these innovations, you really need to think about how are you bringing together people, process, and technology in order to solve problems in the right mix, in the right places at the right time. And also, how are you winning the hearts and minds of the compliance teams who on the ground, their jobs are potentially going to change in a really, really fundamental way. So look, for me, it isn't about what innovations are out there. There's loads of innovations. It's about how do you select the right ones for you, and how do you do the right things yourself in-house that you're best at and that are going to be a differentiator for you, and how do you work with vendors or partners to solve the bits where you don't necessarily need to be differentiated, or it doesn't make sense for you to build your own solution, and you can adopt something and you can get a very, very quick win in terms of speeding up your time to value, speeding up your onboarding. But then after you've onboarded your clients, you have an ongoing regulatory obligation to monitor what they are doing, how they are changing. And that is actually much, much, much more time and labor intensive than that kind of initial onboarding period. I just think there's so much opportunity there, but it is about having that integrated plan about how your operating model is going to change and how you're going to move forward.
No, I think you're exactly right. Where I think the biggest opportunity for change is really around the data. There's so much data out there, and I don't think there's a financial institution in the world that has access to less data now than they did 10 years ago, and both internally but also open source intelligence, or OSINT, as well as the non-traditional feeds that we get as opposed to credit bureaus of the the past is the wrong word, but out of the traditional ones. But I think the key is like integrating it and automating it. That's where I think the technology can play a much bigger role. It's about connecting those dots. It's about then being able to take those and harness those and make decisions based on that full picture, which is something that hasn't been possible in the past. AI obviously is a huge piece, and I know we're going to talk a bit more about AI in a moment, but one of the really key things that we've been looking at as far as reducing friction specifically is being able to use AI to preempt the questions that an analyst during onboarding is going to ask. So for example, a customer uploads their AML policy, have an agent running in the background that then recognizes there's 5 things that are missing from this policy that I need to ask questions about. Or based on that, typically the analyst is going to do these 3 things and is going to need more information. And as part of that onboarding cycle, before they've even submitted the application, it's already asking those questions. It's one less RFI you have to send. It's one less day that it's going to take to onboard the customer, and it makes a massive difference from a customer service perspective.
I could not agree more. That was the point that I was going to make about how you use it as a preparation tool, right? Like as soon as you are interacting with a client, getting a sense for what questions could come up, what could be missing, looking at their data. So I agree that that's a huge tool just to empower yourself to ask better questions. How do you show up in the role that you're in a better way, in a more effective way, and in a more efficient way? And one thing that we think about at Odyssey is something as simple as text archiving, right? We're a smaller firm. The beauty of being a smaller firm is you are more agile, you can move faster. So being able to find a solution for something as simple as that, and if we're talking about language and communication, right, our clients want to be able to text us, right? It's how most of us interact these days. So thankfully, we were able to find a solution where, as part of our onboarding process, we're texting them pretty early on because that is the way that they prefer to communicate with us. So it's just being aware of who you're dealing with, who's on the other side of the table, and what's the flexibility you have to meet them where they're at, but also in a way that is compliant. Obviously, you don't want to create a books and records violation by texting when you're not supposed to. But we will move on because, as Joanna mentioned, we cannot have a panel these days without discussing AI. So we're going to discuss how AI is being used to solve problems around client onboarding and service.
So I think kind of the first thing is that AI is just a smarter, more adaptive compliance. It's not replacing it. It's not just taking and automating what you already have. One of the things that we think about when we're implementing new AI solutions is what is the art of the possible? What is the utopia we want to get to? It may not actually be possible today, but there are steps we can take to get to that utopia. And so that's where some of the pieces that we're implementing at the moment are coming into play. The live input validation is part of it. I talked about the AML policy, but even something as seemingly simple as it's checking IDs and documents before it's being submitted and looking for discrepancies between what's been inputted by the customer and the documents or what's available through OSEND. It's flagging incomplete documents or policies before it's actually coming through, so you're reducing the number of turnarounds with the customer. But also chatbots. It seems simple, but having a chatbot in app that can actually talk about onboarding as opposed to your general customer service chatbot is also going to save time. If customers have questions, they're able to ask right then and not wait for an email out to customer care or whatever it is that then needs to come to the compliance team. The other piece that I do think is important is kind of managing the program behind it as well. Yes, automating risk assessment we've been talking about, but reviewing your policies and standards and procedures on a regular basis to detect gaps, looking at that against the execution and see where you may not be executing against the policies. Looking for errors in execution. Obviously, this all needs QC, but that's also how you're going to make sure that the program is strong.
What a time to be alive. You cannot attend anything right now unless you have a conversation about AI. But it is a massive, massive opportunity. And I think where I see the opportunity is this kind of move from generalized tools that are one size fits all. And I think intelligent document processing is a really good example here where, previously where you would have to take a solution that might have been designed for lots and lots of different purposes, you now can look at specialization specialization of things like data extraction from some of those long and messy unstructured documents that perhaps were not processable in any other way than humans before, and being able to actually move the attention of your people to the things that are truly most important. So a good example of this that we actually have implemented with one of our tier 1 partner banks over the last 2 to 3 years is that we have automated quite a lot of their KYC refresh. So they have a book of work of about 8,000 different clients. They have 8 to 10 documents per client that they need to look at every single year in terms of refresh. Then they have to determine, have you moved risk profile? If you have moved risk profile, what new things do we need to detect for you? And in the middle of all of that, you have humans wading through multiple times all of these different documents. It is possible, because we have seen it, to remove at least 50% of the time from that. And then you can choose to either kind of take your savings back or to reallocate that into things like customer experience. So I think one of the things we've talked about here is, how do you design for good customer experience? I think another is, how do you automate some of the work that keeps you compliant but doesn't impact on customer experience, and take those resources and move them to where they really can make the most difference to your business. But I also think one of the things then that's changing, that's quite interesting for me as a technologist, is that we've always had technology that could be wrong, but we've never had technology that could be confidently wrong and convince us that it was more correct than we were. So I think the role of trust and how you build and design these systems from the ground up to not have people be overconfident, because you can automate data extraction on lots of different parts of your process, but you cannot automate your accountability. The regulator does not care what your model says. The regulator cares about how you have overseen all of these processes. And it is, I think, interestingly, quite easy to put an AI solution into place, but it's not necessarily so easy to monitor it on an ongoing basis and make sure that it doesn't drift in life. So I also think, in terms of, there is a lot of opportunity with AI, but I think it's also going to have some hidden costs.
Absolutely. I like that's a new phrase. So CI instead of AI, confidently and accurate. But when I think of that, I think about, how do we equip ourselves? Again, my firm is a retail firm. We interact with human beings more often than not. And they themselves are using AI, right? So they may come to a meeting now and they have questions that they may not have had a year ago, right? Because they're using it themselves to kind of fact check us in our work. So what I like to, tell our staff is, like, you do the same thing that they might be doing, right? How might they be using AI? What are the questions you might want to be prepared to answer, so that they may have been confidently informed on bad information that you now need to correct, right, as the specialist. So again, I think part of the time saving that you could be used from automation, et cetera, it is, how do you use that time instead to meet the times that we're at, which is how people are getting a lot of disinformation, and doing the work internally so that we know that we are thinking about what they could know that is inaccurate. So one other thing I wanted to throw in the mix here is we use it for simple things. So part of it is what's a low-hanging fruit way to integrate AI into your business so that it's you get used to it, it's easy to do. If I think of note-taking and summaries, right? What are some simple ways that could, from the top down, there could be a yes answer to implementing, so that you start to work out the muscle of, how do I take in this new technology in an easy way, start to figure out what are the best ways to think about this, apply this, what were the problems that were generated, where did it work well, and just kind of doing some analysis around that, and then growing from there in terms of implementing new AI as a resource.
I think, sorry, Roxane, I think that's a wonderful point, right? Because in my broader role as CTO at FinTrU, one of the things that I've had to work on is, how do we get everybody at FinTrU ready for how the world of work is changing? And actually, what's really resonated with our teams is showing them really simple use cases, including transcription and summarization, and basic things like, how do you kind of, start from a blank page and move up has been important. But that kind of, how do you confidently get people to engage with AI? It's going to continue to be a journey.
Absolutely. So moving on to the next question. What role does automation play in manual errors during the client onboarding process?
This one for me.
That's for you.
Okay, so I'm going to answer this from the perspective of our clients, right? Because what we see with the clients that we work with is that there is a very low level of automation in the client onboarding process, right? It's messy, it's unstructured, so they tend to have a good handle on what is the risk profile of the client and all of that stuff. But actually, when you get down on the ground with the operations teams that are looking after these processes, a lot of the, I'm going to quote unquote, automation here consists of a shared mailbox, a SharePoint list, or an Excel, right? Because this is an area that has not received, I think, the investment that it deserves, but we're definitely starting to see that change. And I think there's a lot that you can get out of kind of some very, very basic automation in terms of automating that exchange that you have with the client. Because if you can move that into a single system where you can view with one audit trail all of the interactions with your client. And I don't mean overloading your CRM system or what, like, you know, but we always joke, maybe it's a Northern Ireland thing, we've got McDonald's at home, right? You're not getting a McDonald's because we've got McDonald's at home and you can use the one that we have. Actually really thinking about when you're thinking about automation for these processes, are you thinking about fit for purpose automation for these processes, or are you thinking about adapting something that's really not fit for purpose and isn't going to work? And I think if you can do that and you can have these processes orchestrated in a single and fit for purpose solution, then you can start to think about things like, well, an email is not going to go missing anymore. We're always going to know on an up-to-date basis how we have responded to a client. Then you can start to layer up some of the more advanced techniques like Joanna was talking about. You can have chatbots in there. You can have agents in there that handle specific parts of the onboarding process. But if you do not set out to intentionally unify this in a single place, your automation efforts are going to fail.
Absolutely. 100% agree to that. There's a lot that can be done even with AI to build some of that the workflow tracking, making sure that those kinds of things are able to be caught. I think the other thing from my perspective is that automation equals consistency. It really does just reduce human error and standardize the workflows. So some of that front-end validation that I spoke about, preventing incomplete and faulty documents from coming in the first place that then may be overlooked by an analyst as part of the decision-making process. Making sure then that the analysts are performing consistently right across the board. Looking at trend analyses to make sure that like profiles are being treated consistently. AI co-pilots that are then guiding the analyst to make those right decisions as well is a big piece of that. But also thinking about quality control. I'm sure a lot of institutions, and certainly this is where we are performing quality control on a sample basis. They maybe are looking at 5, 10, 20% of cases that go through and having a 4 eyes check on those. But building the automation correctly, you can start to have constant QC running to the point where 100% all of a sudden is getting QC'd, and you're looking very specifically at ones and overseeing the agents that are doing that QC. Near future, obviously, agentic AI is going to be a huge part of that. Actually starting to recommend decisions based on the entire review process and then having a human at the end that does make that final decision. But in all of this, governance is key. In whether it's basic automation or whether it is true agentic AI and everything in between, like you said, you can't outsource the responsibility. And so particularly for the compliance officers, but everybody who's involved, you need to be able to stand behind the decision that is being made. You need to understand how the models are working and really get comfortable that they are working correctly, which is where that oversight comes into play.
Absolutely. And the idea of automation, we use, I think of integration. And if you're using it in your CRM, building intelligent workflows, like you were saying, that will then direct based on the task that's assigned. Does this apply? Does this not apply? Send it here or send it there. And so it is moving faster, but also smarter, hopefully. And then what that leaves room for is a more personalized approach, right? So again, like by using tools, by automation, what are you creating time for? What can you do better? And one thing that I wanted to point out was that when we, at my firm, when we think about automation, we think about training. Like you talk about governance, again, it's about training staff. And I think from when somebody first onboards at the firm, it is understanding what the culture is. It is understanding the whys of why we do what we do, right? And somebody on the other side of the table may think, this is silly, this is annoying, this is compliance, right? That is not what compliance is. But you want them to understand the why, and that in the end it is to benefit the firm and the customer. And so I think using AI, using all these tools to get better at training staff internally is a big way to use it, and also kind of a safe-ish way to use it, so that if you're doing things wrong, again, in the testing phase, especially for a smaller firm, if you might make a mistake, better to make it between me and you as personnel as opposed to between me and you, a client. So that's an area where we like to focus on, just in training, and how do we use what's out there to better train our staff and ourselves. So we will now move on to the next question. P.S. Chatbots. I know you mentioned chatbots. For all the vendors out there who love chatbots, please, making them a little more user-friendly. I do find that they're not the best out there. And so in my experience, if you are a vendor who's like, you have this as an option, always having somebody to call for now is also super important, because there might be one little nuance that changes the answer to the question that I'm asking. So as a user, it is frustrating to have a chatbot that just doesn't understand what you're saying. So that was just a shameless plug for better developing chatbots out there, or at least a human being as an alternative. And speaking of human beings, where is human oversight still critical to ensure compliance and trust?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on it, right? Like the oversight of the technology you're using, the automation you're using. There's regulatory guidance that says exactly what you need to do to be able to oversee the models, particularly if you're OCC or Fed regulated. There's specific guidance on this. Whilst it's typically for financial risk models, it does extend to AML models as well. And so I fully expect that that's going to continue to extend to AI models that are being used right throughout financial institutions. AML officers, compliance officers, we have to trust the systems, but we also have to be able to explain them to the regulators. This is where I think it becomes a little bit difficult depending on how you're regulated, because some regulators are really far ahead. They get it, they understand, they're embracing AI, or at least they're trying to. You have others that are very much not in that path. So you need to meet them where they are and be able to explain the tech and explain how you're comfortable with the tech, how it operates. But at the same time, I would also say that the regulators need to recognize that technology moves quick. We move very, very quickly, and particularly for those of us in fintech or in crypto, the technology is so cutting edge, and we're going to continue to adopt it. And so we need regulators to also come along that journey with us and recognize that we are going to be first adopters here. Ultimately, regulations are going to have to catch up too. But having that engagement and that constant engagement with your regulators is going to make it that much better as you're going through examination cycles.
So for me, I think one of the really interesting things here is you will still need guardrails, but how do you be thoughtful and intentional about how those guardrails maybe remain the same or change as you introduce increasing AI into the process? And a guardrail does not necessarily have to be human-led, but you cannot escape that burden of accountability. So I think you need to think about a few things, right? I think you need to think from the ground up, how is this auditable and explainable to my clients, to my internal colleagues, and to the regulators? Can I explain how the model worked, why the model made the decision it did, and how I oversee the model on an ongoing basis to ensure that it continues to function effectively? In essence, what does an annual performance cycle look like for a model, right? You review the effectiveness of your human employees on a regular basis. AI is not any different. It but it moves at a different pace. So I think really taking that holistic approach and looking end to end at your processes and saying, well, if we put AI here, what new risks emerge and what new controls might we need to design? But also being smart about what controls you remove because you don't need them anymore. Because if you just layer control over control over control and you never prune them back, you're going to end up with lots and lots of unwieldy processes and overly complicated technology solutions that are trying to do things that are not of benefit to you and to your firm. I also think, there's a really important place for where do I really want to keep humans in the loop and ensure that those humans have oversight, but also how do I make sure that those humans don't turn off the critical thinking part of their brain because they assume that the AI and the automation is going to be more accurate than them.
Yeah, I also want to recognize, we're talking about human interactions. There's a human on the other side. The client is a human. And so I think we also need to recognize that there's going to be that relationship that still needs to exist. You use the chatbots as an example, but particularly when you talk about institutional customers, they still expect a very traditional business-led relationship. And so that shouldn't go away. The constant networking and the ability for those relationship managers to then understand what we're doing in the background, to understand how to interact with those systems is critically important to make sure that you maintain those relationships.
And I couldn't agree more. The critical thinking skills, the looking for bias, right? Like if we're talking about the importance of human oversight, being able to identify bias.
Roxane, I think that's a super important one, right? Because I have a lot of conversations about this where people are like, oh, well, the technology will be less biased than a human. It might be, it might not be. And I think it is really important to be thinking about that when you are designing these processes and solutions.
Absolutely, because ultimately humans, it's our language that they're modeling, right? It's our behavior that they're modeling. So it's learning from us, including our biases. So, so we all agree that, I believe it was an MIT study. With so much data, personally, you start to forget where you are remembering stuff from. But they were talking about how kids coming out of college these days, in a panel before, they mentioned how they are basing the fact off of a headline. And so what it makes me think of is a critical human oversight being, as users of AI, do we understand what is underneath all of that, right? Or are we just explaining a headline? So it's almost like doing a gut check to yourself. Hopefully you have a team of people who help you to remain sharp in what you do yourself. But I would say starting to also utilize these tools as, all right, as a human being, my tendency is to do X, right? It is to read the headline and save the time. But then how am I making sure that I understand everything that's going on underneath this? So I think that's an element of why human oversight is critical. And human oversight of other human beings, basically, is critical in and of itself. And we don't want to destroy trust, ultimately, right? So we know that it takes a lifetime to build and keep trust between you and your client, but it could literally be one bad interaction that was really bad to destroy their trust, right? So I think it's just a reminder of how fragile the business ecosystem can be. And so keeping in mind that ultimately, when you understand that it is about maintaining trust and operating in that currency forever, that's important to keep it top of mind. And for our last question, how do RegTech companies ensure data privacy and security during the onboarding process?
I see you're looking at me there, Roxane. Look, this is I'm going to call it this is a pet topic of mine, right? Because for my many sins, one of the things I was responsible for until recently at FinTrU was information and cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. And I think this whole concept of privacy by design, having worked with very sensitive data at various parts of my career as a technologist, is really, really critical. I think there's just a very few practical things. I think the first thing I would say is that if you have people handling sensitive data, passing it about in emails, in spreadsheets, and it is not contained in a system from which it cannot be extracted, you already have a data privacy problem before you even worry about what your vendors are up to. So I think that would be my first and foremost recommendation, is that anywhere where you're handling sensitive data, particularly with the increase in data privacy laws, that you really, really think about how do you get that into a system so that you can control who views it, so that you can audit who views it, but also that you can provide yourself and your clients with assurance that it is only used for the legal and lawful purposes for which you have collected it as well. That would be the first thing I would say. I think that kind of then leads into collect less, so collect the minimum amount of data that you need to, but really verify that data to make sure that it's accurate, and minimizing the window and the footprint of the data that you hold, I think is super important. So for us, when we design products at FinTrU, we're really thinking about what data do you need? And if you're coming to us and you're saying we need all of this data, we will be challenging you and saying, do you really need it? Because there is a cost to securing it, there is a cost to keeping it. And then designing those products from the ground up to make sure that, things like every single access and audit is audited. So when I worked in communication surveillance in City, we were always very adamant about this, that not only is production access controlled, so are all your vendors controlling who has access to the systems and the data that you have provided, but also are you auditing every single interaction with the system to see who is viewing information, and are they viewing information that they're entitled to, and are they doing it for a good reason? So I actually saw in the news, was that yesterday or today? Sorry, I'm a little bit jet lagged, folks. I have been in New York twice in the last 2 weeks, so I'm not quite sure which part's my head and which part's my feet, about bank employees accessing Mark Carney's information, where they had legitimate access to a system, but they did not have a need to do it. So I think having that inbuilt auditability and traceability not only helps your data privacy and your data protection, but be straight. Processes go wrong. People forget to do things. And when they do, you may be sitting in the middle of a remediation or an investigation trying to figure out what happened. If you are implementing solutions that have auditability driven into them from the ground up, you have a much faster path, not only to be confident that data is being used in the way that it's supposed to, but if there is a suggestion that it hasn't, that you can quickly and easily get to the bottom of who did what and when they did it. So I do think that's it, that kind of data minimization, purpose limitation, and auditability. I think those are all absolutely critical, and you should be asking those of your internal technology teams and your vendors and of your operational teams in terms of process design.
Yeah, and for the financial institutions in the room, the very first thing I would say, and honestly the one thing to take away from this question, I think, is engage your security teams early and often. There's not a single tool that I consider or I go into a POC or anything like that where my security partner is not there with me.
Joanna, I think I might love you, right? Can you come and work in FinTrU with us? Right, because that is music to my ears, right? Having been responsible for this from a firm perspective, your technology team want you to come early, and they are not trying to make your life difficult.
No, absolutely not. And they're going to ask questions that are potentially, more friction, but they're the right ones. One of the first things they always ask is around identity access management. Do you have single sign-on? And that is one of the easiest ways that we are able to control who has access to what. We're able to switch things off when people go on leave, when they leave the firm, whatever it is. It's one click for us to be able to control access. So bring them in and bring them in early.
I could not agree more. Access controls are important. One thing I like to say as a smaller firm is not to be afraid to push back on your vendors, right? So I will actually read a privacy policy, and I will see that it says, what are you doing with my data? And I think sometimes you forget that you are also a customer, and you can, right? If you see regulation moving into a certain direction, don't be afraid to say hey, this doesn't work, right? I need this to be a little bit more stringent. My data needs to be my data, and it needs to be in writing, right? So I think it is again, being critical, but a partner more so, I should say, in helping to develop vendors and being able to tell them hey, this is where we think this is the direction we think it's headed in. And if you are working with somebody who's just kind of hey, we can't do that, this is not what and they don't want to engage in a conversation, they're probably not the right vendor to begin with. We are almost at time. I did want to leave a couple of minutes for questions if there were any in the audience.
Thank you all three for this topic. I think it's really important to pull the curtain back on a number of these things. You mentioned earlier this concept of black box AI and ensuring that AI is as explainable to as many necessary parties as possible. Unfortunately, the biggest players on the stage right now have set a standard of black box by design. Now, it's great when Circle, for example, you can largely design your own system from scratch, but I work for a small RIA. We're stuck with what's fed to us in the industry. So, and a lot of what is out there is derivative of, they've got their ChatGPT API key, but they put their own logo on it, et cetera. So how do you handle that in a situation where I feel like we don't have a lot of sway with the design of these systems? We don't have the ability to say, well, we want it to be auditable. Do you have any tips for managing that when a regulator asks the question of us?
It's a really good question. It's not a new problem. 10 years ago, we were grappling with exactly the same problem of being able to explain to a regulator how a sanction screening algorithm worked. It's the same problem again, just with new technology. So the same principles apply, being able to identify what goes in, what goes out, do your back testing, run parallel testing as you're implementing a new system, and be able to prove that the model is doing exactly what your analysts are doing or what your existing models are doing.
And design your controls for ongoing oversight. Because for me, I think we talk a lot about explainable AI, right? Can you explain the decision-making process that I as a human went through when I made a decision? No, but you can explain the steps along the way, and you can explain how you oversee the outcomes that I deliver.
No other questions. I'm taking it. Well, thank you all for joining us. We hope you learned something.
Thank you.
Enjoy your afternoon.